The Master System gets its answer to Zelda II. Wait, what was the question again? It's Segaiden episode 68. With the arrival of Phantasy Star, the floodgates of role-playing fanaticism had opened at Sega, and the Master System would soon become the premier destination for role-playing fanatics of all stripes. Okay, just kidding. But the few RPGs and RPG-inflected games that did reach the Master System were all pretty notable, as you can see with Golvellius here. I don't know if anyone would mistake Golvellius for an all-time great, but it does have a lot going for it, and the timing of its arrival in December 1988 made for some excellent counter-programming to the NES, where Zelda II carts were beginning to trickle into stores at long last. This is a smaller, simpler, less ambitious game than Zelda II. However, for Christmas 1988, kids could walk into any store and find a copy of Golvellius pretty easily, which was not the case for Nintendo's more precious than Gold Cart. And I can speak from personal experience when I say that the nation's Master System owners took this as an opportunity to gloat. Of course, part of the reason why you could find Golvellius in stores is that Sega did practically nothing to promote the game. If you were alive and even vaguely tuned into console games in 1988, Zelda II promotion had been more or less inescapable for more than a year leading up to its arrival. Zelda II enjoyed multiple magazine covers in an era in which literally the only games magazines being published in the US were in-house rags by Sega and Nintendo. And once it dribbled its way into retail, Nintendo began running commercials during kid-time television hours. Golvellius got zero advance hype, and post-launch it just showed up as one of many games mentioned in the standard pack-in marketing materials. Sega Challenge did devote a single page to the game in its 5th issue, but about a third of that space was devoted to hyping up the inclusion of a password feature. Yeah, Sega didn't even bother to spring for a battery backup on this grand adventure. I guess we can't all be Monopoly. Don't let Sega's bland indifference fool you. Golvellius turned out to be a pleasant addition to the Master System library. It combines action and role-playing elements while combining both a Zelda-style top-down view with a Zelda II-style side-scrolling view. I'd call it one of the better Master System exclusives, except that that's not quite true. Developed by stalwart Sega partners Compile, Golvellius began its life on MSX home computers in Japan sometime in 1987. Yes, like so many NES games that had landed in 1988, it debuted during the post-Dragon Quest mania for the action RPG that gripped Japan during that time. Since my last trip through the Valley of Doom in Metroidvania Works, someone has managed to pin down the MSX cart's debut to April 1987 on Wikipedia, which means that it arrived about 3 months after Zelda II hit Disk System. Given development, manufacturing, and distribution lead times, this means Compile wasn't simply copying Nintendo's homework here. More likely, Golvellius owes its design to a combination of TNE Soft's Hydlide and Namco's Dragon Buster. That is to say, it synthesizes the worlds of computer and arcade action RPGs. I mean, maybe the original Zelda has some influence here, but the whole world doesn't actually revolve around Nintendo, Karen. Given Compile's heritage, that is, working on home computers and porting computer and arcade games to consoles, this reading makes a lot of sense. And it means that the similarities between this adventure and a certain Triforce-seeking adventure over on the other guy's console boil down to convergent evolution, an example of how different people can distill common influences into similar but distinct creations. And that's not even getting into the fact that the very similarly structured Ys Book 1 made its debut on computers about 2 months after Golvellius arrived. Something in the water, I guess. And make no mistake, Golvellius does stand apart from the Zelda and Ys games as an altogether different creation. For one thing, and there's no kind way to say this, it plays a lot more sloppily. I don't know if this is a holdover from its MSX origins, or if Compile's programmers simply felt that stiff, clunky controls make for a more challenging game, but Golvellius lacks the elegant controls of the Zelda series. This really stands out during the side-scrolling sequences, where protagonist Kalisis moves and attacks with an awkwardness that has more in common with the stiff marionette hero of Dragon Buster than with adult Link's limber, Piston Takashi-inspired striking and blocking skills. You move with a sort of ungainly immediacy that disregards the laws of inertia, turning the protagonist into a clumsy lump who can be difficult to maneuver in tight situations. And platforming here takes place entirely in tight spaces. This is not a free-roaming Metroidvania platformer where Kalisis needs to run and jump his way through interconnected passages in search of treasures and objectives. All of the exploration takes place in Golvellius' top-down overworld, and the side-scrolling stuff presents you with a far simpler structure. Move right, never left. It is in fact literally impossible to move left once you enter a dungeon. Golvellius employs ratchet scrolling similar to that of the original Wonder Boy or Super Mario Bros., presumably as a holdover from its MSX-bound origins. The MSX, as we all know, lacked hardware-based scrolling. Golvellius on MSX went for it anyway, though, adopting a choppy, forward-scrolling combat style. It looks a bit like Square's King's Knight, though in a far simpler fashion, and its pairing with the flip-scrolling, open-ended overworld pretty much reads as a Rosetta Stone for Compile's eventual masterpiece, The Guardian Legend. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. That NES all-timer wouldn't hit the US until nearly half a year after Golvellius made its debut here. Compile was really trying to cover all its bases here. Xevious-style vertical shooters, Mario-style platformers, Zelda-style action RPGs. It's all the trends gathered together in a single place, and yet, it still hangs together. The Master System version retains both the vertical and horizontal scrolling sequences, though here they actually scroll, rather than sputtering painfully forward a tile at a time. They still don't let you backtrack, though. Overall, the fundamental essence of the MSX game's scrolling sequences remains in effect on Master System. You can only move forward, battling enemies who pop up, avoiding the scenery, and eventually facing off against bosses. Weirdly, all of the side-scrolling bosses are identical, a gigantic, cartoonish red snake that barfs smaller snakes at you. You fight something like a dozen of these throughout the course of the adventure, and while their snake barfing patterns vary, eventually becoming fireball barfing patterns by game's end, it does feel very samey after a while. It doesn't help that Kalisis' sword skills in the side-scrolling areas are, shall we say, somewhat lacking. He just kinda holds out his sword and hopes things bump into the tip. Golvellius' Hydlide roots in action. Kalisis can strike high or low, which puts him one step ahead of the Fazanadu guy, but otherwise don't expect nuanced combat in these areas. The one saving grace for combat, I suppose, is that you don't fight the game's actual bosses in the ratchet scroll scenes, but rather in top-down arenas. The linear platforming portions are just conduits to reach the real bad guys or to access new areas. More of a side diversion to the main quest than the meat of the actual adventure. It can be somewhat annoying to find your progression hits a brick wall in these zones, since they do demand a bit more dexterity and action game reflex than the overworld sequences, but unusually for a Master System release, Golvellius never becomes difficult enough to truly frustrate. It helps that you can do quite a bit of grinding and beefing up in the overworld. Golvellius doesn't bother with experience points. You boost your health by acquiring items and purchasing life-up enhancements. The cash you score can be traded for superior gear, and money flows pretty quickly, so there's no real reason not to enter each dungeon kitted out for success, with the best resources available at the moment. Golvellius does differ from Hydlide and the original Zelda in one significant way. You can't just wander the overworld willy-nilly from the start. The Valley of Doom consists of several separate regions that only open up as you complete game objectives, like defeating bosses and performing minor tasks for the handful of NPCs who live in caves throughout the world, as NPCs so often love to do. Incidentally, the NPCs here demonstrate the sharpest localization we've seen on Master System to date. Not that there's been a lot of in-game text so far in the console's library, but the most verbose game up until now, Phantasy Star, took a very straightforward approach, presumably due to the intense memory limitations created by cramming such a huge adventure into a 4-meg cart. Golvellius lacks the variety and range of content of Phantasy Star, so it seems like Sega's localization team had the room to goof around a bit. The characters here can be memorably sharp-tongued, especially the old woman who bombards you with withering verbal abuse if you try to buy something from her with insufficient cash on hand. And minor NPCs like the stray fairies around the realm often come off as snarky or flighty. In some ways, it almost feels like a dry run for the working design's localization style, albeit in the terse, limited style of a tiny 8-bit ROM. Whatever the case, the zippy dialogue gives Golvellius a little extra flavor and helps it to stand apart from other games of the era, where in-game text generally fell into two categories: dry or incomprehensible. It also neatly sums up the overall Golvellius experience, a game with a lot of heart and personality, even if it didn't exactly set new standards for action RPG design. Golvellius for Master System maintains the speedy pace you'd expect from a Sega title, but it manages to be the most robust action RPG to have appeared to date on the system. I don't know that Sega of America's marketing department ever really managed to reorient their approach to properly embrace the evolving nature of the Master System's lineup, but even if the company didn't quite know how to sell a game that did more than simply bring the arcade experience home, the home console team back in Japan could clearly see which way the wind was blowing and did a pretty solid job of updating the console's lineup to reflect the changing tastes of game enthusiasts. For their part, Compile clearly enjoyed the results of their collaboration with Sega here. A year after the Mark III launch of Golvellius as Mao Golvellius or Evil King Golvellius, they backported it to MSX as a sort of semi-sequel to the original game called Shin Mao Golvellius. The game has largely fallen into obscurity since then, never having been collected or compiled for latter-day systems. Happily, it's not too hard or too expensive to come by these days, and it makes a worthwhile pickup for anyone looking to kill a few hours with a perfectly solid 8-bit action RPG. You can see signs of the games that inspired Golvellius in its design, and if you look hard, you might even see elements of Golvellius that influenced later games. And even if you don't want to train spot your way through video game history, it's still a pretty good time on its own merits. Next time on Segaiden, better start saving up those flag points.